Okay, so what we're going to do today here, guys, and I've shown you a little bit already, but this crank was severely damaged due to the flywheel being too loose, and it was rocking back and forth, and it actually broke a big chunk out of the crank. What we're going to do is kind of show you guys the process of taking the motor out. Everybody's going to be a little bit different, but the theory is going to be the same. When you guys are removing the engine from a bike, some of your motors are going to be a bottom mount where your tab's down here for your motor mount. Some are going to be up here in the front. Some are going to be in the top, depending on what type of bike you have. But your main goal here is to take the whole motor out. Obviously, you've got to disconnect your spark plug cap here. You've got to disconnect your throttle cable. A lot of guys, what you can do is actually just take off the whole entire carb. So in this scenario, I'll just go over there and pop the whole carburetor off, just because it makes no sense to pull the cable off when this one is just one screw. So we're going to take this carburetor off. Then we're going to make sure all the wiring's disconnected, which entails your wiring connector here, comes up through the floor, and comes off here. So you just disconnect this here. Every bike is going to be a little bit different depending on what type of scooter you're working on, but your wiring needs to come off. Wiring has to come off, which also includes your cap here for your ignition for your spark plug. Your carburetor needs to come off, and your brake line as well. So if you've got a disc brake bike in the rear, you've got to take your hydraulic line off and let the fluid out as well. You've got a drum brake bike, all you've got to do is just disconnect this guy here, pull this cable back out through this arm. So that disconnects all the kind of auxiliary stuff. Once you guys get that stuff disconnected, the next step is to remove the shock bolt here, which is going to disconnect the motor from the shock, or you can do it up here. And then also on the Honda Elite, Honda Dio, you've got one bolt here that goes all the way through the engine case into the other side. So put a wrench on the other side and a socket over here, pop this bolt out, and this whole motor will simply just come right out and will allow you to do the crank. Make sure all your guys' stuff comes off, do a double take on the motor, like Paul said. Yeah, like Paul said, if you've got a liquid-cooled bike, you may have a liquid-cooled sensor. If you've got an air-cooled bike, you'll probably have an air-cooled sensor up here. Not everybody's running it, of course. Some bikes have it factory, and then some bikes are going to be like an aftermarket Trail Tech or whatnot. So let's go ahead and get this bike taken apart so we can pull this crank out. So now you've got the engine out of your bike. Depending on what type it is, it's going to look different. The next step you guys want to do, pop your wheel off the bike. You're going to have one nut on this side, and it's going to depend obviously on the bike that you have. This size will depend. So you want to take the wheel off the bike. Then the next step, you want to take the stator system off here. Be very careful not to damage any of these wires or strip any of these threads. You want to take this off here. Finish taking the rest of your shrouds off your bike. The Honda Elite has one bolt up here, and the Dio as well, and one bolt here on the front. These are 10 millimeter head. Your shroud comes off. Then what we're going to do is you've got 4 long bolts here that compress the head and the cylinder to the cases. Once you pull those 4 bolts off, this whole entire cylinder is going to come off. We'll remove actually this one. So once the cylinder and everything comes off, you'll take the piston out of the bike, push the piston out and the pin, save all those parts and pieces. Obviously you don't want to lose any of that stuff. This one we're going to get new C-clips, obviously new gaskets, because it's all going to go back together, but the cylinder is relatively new. Shouldn't need any other repairs other than that. Pull this system off here, and then again, depending on your bike, you're going to have an intake manifold. Some of the intake manifolds are going to go into the case like this, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts. Those 4 bolts come off, and this whole intake manifold comes off. So that pretty much takes care of your cylinder and your intake manifold coming off the top. Then you'll be able to access the rod and the top end. Once you've got that stuff taken apart, you guys want to take this nut off here, pull the whole variator off, dry face. Any components you have in here are going to come out, and then that will allow you to access the crank. So let's go ahead and get that stuff taken apart, and then once we get to that phase, I'll show you guys how to split the motor. So we've got the cylinder off this bike. This is a good time to mention, show you guys kind of the importance of Honda Bond. This engine did seal up after we figured out where the problem was, and not that every motor is going to have this issue, but as you saw when this gasket, this is your base gasket here, when I pulled the cylinder up, it wasn't sticking together or anything like that. It's basically just metal on metal. So you don't have any type of adhesive or any type of seal on this. It does make it nice when you're changing stuff or you need to access your motor later, you forget something, or I don't know, you make a mistake or blow up your piston and your parts go in your bottom end. But at the end of the day, that shouldn't be what's happening. But you just see here how this gasket sits on here. If you have any imperfection on your engine, these are kind of things you want to take note of. It's really common. I shouldn't say really common, but some guys will, you know, in the past have two different engine cases and they'll join them together. Say, you know, somebody runs around with just one bolt on the exhaust and snaps an ear off, and they buy just the side case. There's oftentimes these cases are different where they're sold. Honda sells them as a mated set. It's not individual when they sell them and when they build these bikes. So this is a nice, perfect. It's nice and perfect and smooth. You can't feel a lip over here. But if you guys have a motor that has a lip here, keep in mind that this has to be flat here and then also on the back, because what's going to happen is this gasket's going to sit on top of here and it's going to sit crooked and it's going to allow air to get in and out of here, and that's where you're going to have your air leak, and that's what blows these bikes up. This bike looks, actually the motor looks really good, other than the bad crank, but it's just things you want to keep in mind of. This is really clean. He did a really good job cleaning this before we got the bike, so this should be a pretty easy job. I don't see anything else detrimental. Everything else looks pretty good, but obviously we're going to go through and clean all this material off here. That's just the old OEM paper that's stuck here to the intake. But there you have it. Just something to keep in mind on that guy there. It's always a good idea to put a rag down in here. That way when you're working on stuff, this piston's not banging around back and forth. Obviously, if it's your stock piston and you're getting rid of it, it doesn't really matter. Now that the cylinder's off, variator's off, intake manifold is off, the next step, as we talked about earlier, is removing the stator. So what you have here on this is your pickup here. You have two 8mm for your pickup, and then you have two 8mm here for your stator itself. So once you pull all those bolts off, 1, 2, 3, 4, this just simply pulls off the bike, and you pull out this rubber plug here, and you can take the wiring harness off. Once you've pulled the electronics off, you're going to take out these 8mm bolts. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So those bolts are the ones holding the case together. That's what's pinching the case together. You're going to pop those off, these two. If you guys get those off and you have a hard time getting that case to split, take a minute and really look things over, because if you forgot a bolt or missed something, say you didn't see this one because it's kind of dirty in the same color as the case, you're gonna mess your cases up. You're gonna strip threads. You're gonna really mess things up and do some damage. So make sure when you guys are doing this, all the bolts are off, and you're really taking time to make sure everything's disconnected and done properly. Let's go ahead and pull the rest of this apart and get this crank out of here. All right, Paul, I'm gonna call him. So we have a really bent spree, and what?
Come up here and call him so I can actually get work done.
Oh, you're gonna film?
No, you can call him on the phone out here.
So the spree is really bent. Paul, can you vouch for this bent spree?
It's a little bent.
Let's go see it. And I
Too bad.
I put it on Craigslist, and somebody asked if they could ride it home. Technically, you could. Legally, safety-wise, probably not. But here she is, a shop runner. Got the sweet strut brace thing on here. It's been jumped. We shifted the seat back with the custom bungee cord on this side. And I'm tired of looking at it because the guys ride it back and forth to get parts, and somebody's gonna die on it. So I put it up for sale, and this guy wants to ride it home. So let's give him a call.
So where exactly on the frame is it bent?
The whole thing is bent, pretty much. I think somebody's doing like tabletop jumps on it or something like that.
Oh Jesus.
Yeah, I mean,
So when you go down the street, like, what happens?
it's kind of like wants to ride a wheelie all the time. Kind of not all the time. If you lean forward and get your weight forward, you should be able to keep the front wheel down.
That's just nuts, man.
Yeah.
I was hoping it wasn't that bad.
Sweet.
Okay, well, thanks for the call. It sounds a little bit too scary to me.
Yeah, come on. You don't want to ride wheelies all the way home?
Oh, man.
Come on, that's take your man points up really high.
All right, as long as you're my photographer.
That's a deal, actually.
All right, man. Good luck.
Okay, yeah.
All right, bye.
Bye. How can you tell it's not bent in the picture?
It's pretty bent.
It's really bent. He goes, "Where's it bent?" I'm like, "The whole thing is bent."
Well, it's the front fork.
Lost the sale. On your wiring harness, okay, this is coming from the bottom side of the engine, as you can see. There's going to be a 10 millimeter right here. That's your ground for your starter. And then you're also going to have this clip right here. That's a connector. You just push down on it. This is a connector for your electric start. Push down on it. That guy comes right out. Take this clip off, comes right off. Then you're going to want to take this 10 millimeter, loosen it up, and that's going to allow your wiring harness to completely come off the engine. So now we have all the bolts removed out of this side of the motor. It's a nice, fresh, clean slate. You can see the crank seal in here. Get a better shot of kind of how the crank broke there. But now the motor's pretty much ready to split. The next step is to take the crank splitter tool, and it bolts to the case here. What it does is it basically creates a surface here and pushes the crank out this way. So in that aspect, a lot of guys will tap this out with a hammer if they don't care about their stock crank. I don't care about this crank, obviously, because it's already damaged, but the proper way to do it is to use a crank pusher, and it pushes it out this way. Let's go ahead and get that crank pusher set up. We're gonna do it on this side, and then this side I'll just probably just tap out, but let's get that process started. We've got the crank pusher tool installed now, and the way this works is you've got 3 arms. There's a few different styles. This is gonna be your most common. This is a 17 millimeter. And what you wanna do here, guys, is you wanna center up your crank right in line with this bolt here. And then you've gotta pick your mounting points. And obviously you want this to be as spread out as possible to disperse the stress on this side of the case as much as you can. Unfortunately, with this motor, really the only way to do it here, the only mounting point is this one, and this one. Obviously you can't go to any of these things in here because that's what holds the motor together. Make sure when you're putting your bolts in this scenario that you're bolting to just this case half and nothing more. And if your bolts are too short, you're going to strip out these threads. You're going to put a lot of force on all these bolts. If you have strip threads, you know, say that this piece of your case is stripped out, do a nut and bolt, clamp it nice and tight. The next step here, we're going to just roll this around with a wrench. You can use an impact, but I'm just going to use a wrench so I can show you guys kind of how this thing works. As you guys can see, this case is getting split right here in the center. If you're opening this up and you see it going one way or another, or say the top is opening and the bottom's not, then what that's telling you is that you've got a bolt or you've missed a bolt. So again, this is not really technical stuff here. It's pretty simple, but the key here is just to make sure you're kind of double checking everything as you do it, and you just keep rotating and rotating. It'll just pop right out like so. You just keep going until eventually you'll see you just got a ton of slack here. And at that point, you can simply take the case, just pull it right off, and there you go. Once you've got the case half off, again, this scenario is a little bit different because he's got all brand new parts, so we want to keep everything nice and fresh. You can use a pair of needle nose pliers and you can take that C-clip out of there. What I typically do is just, again, because we're not going to reuse this clip here, I just take and just pry and just hold my thumb on that C-clip and just pops right out. So once the C-clip comes out, again, you're going to dispose of that. You're not going to use it. You only need one C-clip to come out because you're simply going to take this, turn it sideways, and you're going to reach in here and you're just going to push this piston pin back out the other side. Sometimes they can be seized up in there. This one's not going to be because it's a pretty new setup. So just give it a little tiny push. And they do make piston pin pullers as well that are going to push this out. So once you push it out, you can grab onto this and pull it out the other side, or use a piston pin pusher that actually pushes it through the piston and out the other side. When it comes to installing bearings in these cases, there's a couple different ways of doing it. A little chunk of Honda Bond in there. A couple different ways of doing it. You know, some guys will heat up the cases and freeze the bearing and they drop right in. That's really common. Some guys will freeze the bearings and press them in a little bit. So a few different ways of doing this, but what I'm going to do today, I've got the OEM Honda bearings that have been in the freezer for about a day. I'm gonna go ahead and hit these both with the heat gun. Gonna pull out, this is our billet delete plug here that we've got. Gonna go ahead and pull that out. Bummer, it's all Honda bonded up and sealed, but we're gonna take that out just to make sure this heat doesn't affect the Honda Bond here. But anyhow, gonna go ahead and heat these cases up and you guys will see how the bearings just drop right in. Once the bearings are in these cases, then the next step is to pull the crank into one side and then pull it into the other. And I'll kind of show you that process as well, including the process with the Honda Bond on the cases. We have a lot of videos on engine building, but I don't think I have a single one that goes from a complete teardown to a complete reassembly. So that's kind of what this is going to serve. Today we're also going to put together a few RC1 motors, but this is going to be the main purpose of this video. So let's go ahead and get started and put some bearings in this guy.
I'm already out, already on the countdown. I'ma set it right. Got the backlash written on me, cold running from the pole, and it's on me. Don't know which way we're going now, I don't wanna know it. Might as well be going down, I don't wanna know it. I got the backlash written on me, caught robbing on a glass bowl, I've been ballin'. Free my ladies in the counter now, I'm already out, already on the countdown, I'ma set it right. Got the backlash written on me, cold running from the pole, and it's on me. Don't know which way we're going now, I don't wanna know it. Might as well be going down, I don't wanna know it. Yeah, come and get it, clock is ticking for my riches now. Yeah, boy, counting commas in my kitchen now. Yeah, right, Colorado ain't my region now. But now I'm headed out there anyhow. Set it out like I'm headed out for the big amount. Shoot it out like I'm heading out for the pictures now. How many people could do it the way I did it now? I really mean it, I feel like the only one around. Whoa, while I'm at it, I ain't kidding, I won't have it. Try and wait for me to slip, I ain't no Bambi. I'll be center in a rink, I'm Joey Sackage. And when you see me, I just came out with the hat trick. Oh God, don't be stressing with the magic. Acting out cause you ain't never seen no rabbits. All them bunnies, they be helping me.
Now the bearings are in. They're seated nice and flush and flat on both sides. I'm gonna go ahead and kind of get the area prepped for the crank install using the, what we're gonna use here is the Motion Pro crank puller tool. And I may put these on the website, not too sure, but comes with these two guys here and then the inner shaft as well. So I'll show you guys how that goes and we'll just get this crank sucked in. All right, so we finally got the old crank out, got it all cleaned up. I've got the new Melosi crank pulled in one side. I'm not going to show you how to do both sides because it's theoretically the same thing. But on this side, what you're going to do is use a crank tool. I'm using the Tusk crank tool here, and it's going to bolt to the case, connect here, and pull this crank into this side. So now we have this crank all the way in on one side. So the next step is take Honda Bond, do a nice thin layer of Honda Bond around here on this side as well, and then you're going to join the cases together. And you're going to mount the Tusk tool on the other side, and what that's going to do is that's going to put force on the crank, pulling the crank this way into the case, and that's going to join this whole thing together. A couple things to keep in mind: make sure you have your little locating dowels here. That's going to locate the crank to make, or the cases to make sure it's all square and true. If these are dented or squished or hollowed out, or ovaled out, it's not going to fit on here right. So make sure these are in good shape. This surface is 100% clean, and make sure your rod obviously is in the right orientation when you pull it in. If you have your rod, you know, here over the edge and you go to pull it in, you're going to bend this rod. Go ahead and take your time with this, but we'll show you how this thing goes back together. It's relatively simple. As far as sealants go, Honda Bond is the go-to. Yama Bond will also work as well, but just make sure you use a really high quality sealant here. There's no paper gasket that goes here on this bike. It's just going to be a quality sealant. Let's go ahead and pull this crank in. Crank tool installed on this side. It's connected to the nut on the crank. and it's resting up against the case. We've got a thin layer of Honda Bond in between here. So the next step, you want to hold this guy straight, and you just want to keep an eye and make sure everything is parallel and even as you pull this together. You're going to take your wrench on this side, just rotate this around and join these two together. Once they're butted together and this gap is closed, you're going to take your bolts from this side and you're going to install them to keep this thing pinched together. When you've got that section of it done, you're totally done with pulling this this crank case section together, and make sure your crank spins free and everything as well. You've got the crank pulled in now. What you want to do is make sure it rolls around nice and smooth. No resistance, no issues at all. Once you've got this together, now let's go ahead and put the bolts in here, snug them down. Once you've got all these nuts in here, I just drive them in just slowly with an impact driver. You want to go through and you want to hand tighten them all to spec on whichever type of motor you're doing. And also you just want to make sure that this rolls around nice and smooth after all the work is done. So this guy rolls around nice and smooth. The next step is to just torque all these guys down. You're going to put your crank seals in both sides. They just, you want to grease the inside and outside of the crank seals and slide one over this side and push it in to where it's flush. And you're going to do the same thing on this side. Once you get your crank seals in and you've got some assembly lube in there, what I like to do is just put a little bit of two-stroke oil in here. If your motor's going to sit for a while and maybe you've got to order a cylinder or something like that, it's not a bad idea to hit this area with a little bit of oil. That way it doesn't corrode. Some areas, depending on where you live, this steel is going to corrode really fast and get some surface rust on it. So if it's going to sit for a while, be sure to put a little bit of oil in there and lube it up. But that's pretty much it for putting a crank in a bike. You guys saw how we split the case. You saw how we pulled the crank out. The bearings went in, and then we pulled one side in and pulled the other side in. A common thing that people will do is they'll take a press and they'll set this in a press and they'll actually press the crank into one of the side cases and then press it together. What that's going to do is that's going to put a lot of stress right here on this bearing here in the center, and your crank is going to be pretty much ruined after you do that. So keep in mind, use the proper tools. Motion Pro, sorry, it wasn't a Tusk. Motion Pro makes a really good one, and Tusk make one too. So if you guys have any questions about doing this, post down below. Again, this is going to be the same theory behind any two-stroke CVT motor, just in the aspect that it comes apart and goes together the same way. So thanks for watching. You guys have any questions, go ahead and post below.